G'day, everyone. Ooh, g'day. Hello? Hello. There we go. G'day, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. Can I just double check that the people up the back can hear us? Yes, excellent. Thanks so much for joining us this evening and welcome to Politics in the Pub. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and I'm so delighted that you've all come along on what is a bloody freezing evening in Canberra. If you'll excuse me, I just got back from a holiday in a lovely warm place and I am resentful of Canberra's weather. Haven't quite slid back into Canberra winter mood yet. I do want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that welcome to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here this evening, or indeed watching us on the live stream. I also want to draw attention to the fact that it is end of financial year. And we're currently doing our big end of financial year appeal. And if you enjoy Politics in the Pub or the Australia Institute's research, one of the best ways that you can support us is by making a tax-deductible donation. And you can do that either with Hannah at the back of the room or just by visiting australiainstitute.org.au. I will, if you'll allow me a bit of a humble brag, say that you'll get a fantastic return on investment for your donations. I have been looking at some of the impacts that the Australia Institute has had over the past few years, and if you'll remember the changes to the Stage 3 tax cuts that I think our research played a huge role in driving, that shifted $84 billion over 10 years from high to low and middle income earners. I think that's a pretty great return on investment for everyone's donations. So please consider supporting our research that matters and that changes minds this year. Thank you so much for attending this evening. I'm really excited about tonight's event. I hope you all know as well that we're here to talk to, obviously, Dr Emma Shortis, author of our inaugural essay in our ongoing series Vantage Point called After America. Please give Emma a round of applause. Before I tell you a little bit more about Emma, I did also want to say that if you haven't got a subscription already to Vantage Point, you can do that on our website. And if you don't have a copy yet, they are on special tonight here in this venue for the absolute amazing price of $10. So make sure that you pick one up before you go if you haven't read it yet. So Emma is not only an amazing colleague, but a historian and writer focused on history and the politics of the United States and its role in the world. You may recognise her from the many, many media interviews she's been doing, especially since Donald Trump assumed the presidency once again. And that's what Emma's Vantage Point essay is about, After America, Australia and the New World Order. On Emma's extensive research about the Australia-US relationship and her recent experience where she travelled to the United States as part of the election campaign there, and it looks a lot at, I guess, the current landscape and how Australia can chart its own path to prosperity and security. So don't forget, if you haven't got, you can grab it at the back of the room from Hannah. Sorry, my notes are all stuck together here. Lots of fabulous questions for Emma this evening, and I don't want to miss any. But Emma, I just want to start, I guess, with overall, I mean, Australia has had a huge and ongoing relationship with the United States for a long time now, but at the moment it's looking pretty unrecognisable. We had a political assassination of a state leader just in the last few days. Donald Trump has talked about deploying the military against American civilians to quash protests. Things have gotten pretty bad pretty quick.
They have gotten really, really badly, really quickly. And I think even those of us who thought it would get pretty bad in a second Trump presidency have been maybe a little bit taken aback about at how quickly things have gotten this bad. You know, we have, as you said, a president literally deploying the military against his own people, against Americans, and posting on Truth Social just this week on his site that they explicitly are going to use Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE, to target Democrat power centres. This is the kind of man that we are dealing with. You know, he's been telling us who he is for a decade now, and really, I think it's time we listened. But Australia, or I guess the Australian kind of foreign policy establishment, people who manage the everyday of the security alliance, see that alliance, and have done for 75 plus years, as based on quote unquote shared values. And that held true, I think, for a long time, you know, despite some of the tensions in that relationship, the way that previous administrations have tested those shared values, you know, that largely held true. And I think Australians had a lot of faith in Australia's relationship with the United States. But in the face of Donald Trump, to be saying, as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence Richard Marles did just a couple of weeks ago on national television, that Australia and the United States share values, and to specify, which he did, that those shared values are democracy and the rule of law. Exactly. It defies belief, and it's pretty extraordinary that our leaders are apparently unable to see what is happening in front of them when the Australian people can see it. You know, we've done polling at the Australia Institute around people's understanding of the Trump administration, how they see the Trump administration, and now we found that a majority of people, 54%, think that Australia should pursue a more independent foreign policy over a closer alliance with the United States. And that's a direct reflection of what Trump is doing, and our leaders just haven't quite caught up with that yet.
Before we kind of move on to other things, I just wondered too if you could put this current Trump administration in a bit more context in terms of how he compares, I guess, with the story of the United States over recent decades, because as much as he's an anomaly, there's ways in which he isn't as well. Can you just put him in a little bit more context in terms of history for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, it's right to say that Trump is in many ways an anomaly because, you know, of his nature, of the way he approaches politics, just the kind of extremes that he goes to. But I think we've seen highlighted just in the last couple of days how much what Trump is doing is a product of American history, and especially America's recent history in its military adventurism. You know, Trump came to power in part on a promise to pull the United States out of the forever wars. He was the first conservative right-wing figure to really stand up and say that the Iraq War was a mistake. And we, I think, underestimate the power of that, the pull of that to a huge number of Americans who are exhausted with the forever wars. But what we're seeing now is Trump kind of being trapped by recent American history and being dragged back in, potentially, into the Middle East. And he is doing that. The momentum is there to do it. His willingness to kind of break international law, to break American domestic law to do it, is because previous administrations did the same thing. You know, they have created the space for Trump, not just internationally, but at home as well. You know, the fact that George W. Bush went into Iraq illegally without seeking a declaration of war from Congress like he is legally supposed to do creates the space for Donald Trump to do the same kind of thing in Iran, and to talk openly about regime change in Iran, to talk openly, to post openly about assassinating leaders of other states. You know, there is precedent for that in the United States, and there is precedent for almost everything that Trump does. He is, in many ways, he is the logical conclusion of American history. You know, he's not an aberration, and that also means, I think, it's important to say that we can't just wait him out. You know, there's this sense, I think, still in Australia that we've just got to manage this situation. We've just got to kind of ride the wave, and in 2028 or whatever, we'll go back to normal. that's not what's going to happen.
Do you think some Democrats in the Democrat Party have kind of thought that way as well? And is that still the case?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the case. I think we've seen just extraordinary complacency from the leadership of the Democratic Party, the established leadership of the Democratic Party, that have been unwilling to push back on Trump. You know, they're talking about politics as if we're still kind of abiding by the usual playbook, you know, that you can oppose Trump on some legislation, but you've got to pick your battles and, you know, agree with him on some things. You know, it is quite extraordinary, especially when you consider that the party as a whole during the election campaign themselves framed Trump as a direct threat to American democracy. A lot of them aren't acting like that's true when it is true. But I think there's also, I don't want to be too negative about it, though it's hard not to be. There are indications that individuals in the Democratic Party understand the threat that Trump is posing, but also understand the political appetite for opposition to him. And you can see that even in the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who has come out rightly really strongly against what Trump is doing in California, and there's a huge appetite for it. You know, the hits he's getting on some of his speeches are in the millions, you know, numbers that other politicians could only dream of. So I think we see the potential seeds of a mobilisation there, but I also don't think that the Democratic Party as a whole is going to save American democracy.
I want to take you back to the actual election campaign, because you're in the United States for that. Can you just tell us a little bit about what it was like, kind of, I know you went to a Harris rally in the last couple of days, and then obviously we saw Trump's victory. What was it like on the ground while you were there?
Yeah, it was a pretty wild experience, Eb, and I think I'm not likely to go back anytime soon. It's probably the last one in a while.
No, we don't want you to disappear into some ice black hole somewhere.
Yeah, a strong possibility of that, I think. So I was in the States for the election campaign, and went to a couple of Kamala Harris rallies. I went to one in Charlotte in North Carolina, which was a pretty extraordinary experience, you know, seeing that the kind of mobilisation of the celebrity of American politics as such a slick operation, and you know, local politicians were turned into celebrities, where, you know, the equivalent of the candidate for the state minister of agriculture got a kind of rousing reception, cheering and stomping, and so the theatre of it was incredible, but it also had this kind of sense of being manufactured, I think, you know, especially around Harris. There was a kind of celebrity around her, but in the crowd at this event in Charlotte in particular, you know, Harris was giving her speech and hitting all of her lines. You know, she was charming, she was just the right amount of funny, she was engaging, but she was speaking in kind of great technocratic detail about a particular policy that would stop price gouging in certain parts of supermarkets. And you could tell even the audience, even the people who were there were fully on board with Harris herself, were not convinced by this kind of policy. And, you know, that was put in contrast to her promise to bring real change, especially to young people. And I think nobody ever really believed that. You know, the Democratic Party, Biden and then Harris really, I think, refused to acknowledge the pain and suffering and insecurity of Americans. And so the campaign was never convincing. And that was really clear, I think, in hindsight. So that was a pretty extraordinary experience. And then I also went to, Harris had what was supposed to be her election victory party at Howard University in Washington, D.C. So I was there on the night that her loss became clear and she didn't appear, and then went to her concession speech the next day, which was a really harrowing experience, partly because at Howard it's a historically black college, and so most of the people in the audience were young black students. And the thing that struck me the most is that particularly the young black women were very subdued, but none of them were crying. And it really struck me that they had known all along what America does to them and how it treats them. You know, they knew what was coming. So it was a particularly harrowing experience, and especially in light of all that's come after it, something that will stay with me for a long time.
Yeah, and obviously understood the stakes in very personal terms as well. So obviously one of the huge features of our relationship with the United States in recent years has been the AUKUS Security Pact. Each of the 3 countries in AUKUS has since had a change in government since that was agreed, and a change in leadership. And the United States and the UK have both had kind of big, or one's the US has just announced a big inquiry into the deal. But Australia we floated into it without any real debate, and we haven't even really had a big parliamentary debate or inquiry, have we?
No, we've had almost nothing. And that is pretty extraordinary when you think about the nature of this deal. You know, if it succeeded, it's a heroic if, it would be the biggest shift in Australian defence policy in decades. It would be the biggest transfer of Australian sovereign wealth in our history. And it was cooked up by a few blokes in suits and uniforms behind closed doors, sprung on the Australian people overnight. It wasn't put to Treasury, as far as we know. It was barely put to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
What's $368 billion between allies?
That's right. Well, as former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg said, anything's affordable if it's a priority. Right? And this is the attitude, you know, that there is no accountability when it comes to spending in defence, but also when it comes to decision making. You know, we know very little about the deal. Often the stuff we do know comes from the United States, comes from the Congressional Research Service in the United States, not from our own government. And it is extraordinary in a democracy, in what I think we should think of as a vibrant democracy, as an example to the world of a imperfect but relatively successful democracy, that a decision like this has had no democratic scrutiny whatsoever. And the resistance to that scrutiny, I think, is also extraordinary, but is explained, I think, at least partly by the fact that this deal is a disaster for Australia, and is very likely to fall over. You know, I don't think it would survive any kind of genuine independent scrutiny, and I think many of the people involved in it are very aware of that.
And just to kind of lay out the stakes for people, like when we talk about it being a huge deal, Australia previously has not really contemplated nuclear submarines, for example. There's not only the doubts around, you know, will submarines ever really be delivered, but also I think on the nature of the deal itself. And when you talk about the nature of the deal and some of the problems that might not survive scrutiny, I mean, do we even have the workforce that we would really maintain sovereign capability if we go down this path?
I think the way it was explained to me by one defence expert is that every link in the AUKUS chain is weak. The question is which one breaks first, right? And that's because there are problems, significant issues with workforce in Australia, to the point where, you know, some positions for nuclear engineers have been advertised with the tagline, "No experience necessary."
It's reassuring.
I did not make that up. So there are questions of workforce, there are questions of manufacturing capability in Australia, and there are really deeply serious questions about the capability of the US submarine industry and shipbuilding industry. That's why Australia has already handed over an $800 million no strings attached deposit to the US shipbuilding industry. It's in the hope that that will help them to up production so they can meet their own requirements and then eventually, presumably, meet ours. We've done
what a deal.
And it is, I mean, it's extraordinary to think about, like, what other deal like that can you think of where the agreement is that you hand over a deposit with no guarantee of return? Like, if we don't get the submarines, we don't get the money back. Or, you know, in the I guess the deal, parts of the deal that we do know about, we know that we've indemnified the UK and the United States. So if they eventually give us stuff, submarine parts or designs or whatever, that don't work or aren't clear, That's too bad. That's on us. It's not on them. You know, this is an extraordinary contract, and this is only what we know about it. So to sign up to this, knowing full well, because the US Congressional Research Service has told us that the US can't meet its own needs, the UK can't meet its own needs, is dramatically behind in its own nuclear-powered submarine deals. What makes us think that Australia, which has no experience in building these kinds of machines...
Oh, none necessary.
You know, what makes us think that we can do that? But I think that also, you know, sometimes we get a little bit bogged down in those kind of technical questions, which obscures the bigger question of, like, should we do that? Is that a good idea? Do we want submarines that are designed for, quote unquote, forward defence, which means going a long, long way from Australian shores to threaten other nations, probably on behalf of the United States or involved with the United States? Is that what we want? And would that actually make us safer? And I think they're pretty big question marks.
They are. That's, yeah, pretty fundamental question to answer. And I mean, if this does all fall over, or, you know, if Trump pulls one of his specials and, you know, tanks the whole thing or whatever, what options are there for Australia? Are we kind of just attached to this deal no matter what?
Well, I mean, at the moment, that's what our leaders are telling us. You know, they're literally saying there is no plan B and we don't need a plan B. And that, I mean, aside from anything else, that's a catastrophic failure of government. It is the government's job to plan for worst case scenarios, hope that they don't materialise, do everything you can to make sure they don't materialise, but still plan for them. And that, at least as far as we know, is not happening. There is no plan B. And that leaves Australia in a very dangerous position, you know, with a significant capability gap, if you want to talk about the defence issues, but also, you know, potentially with an eye-watering investment in something that doesn't actually make us safer. You know, there are so many things that we could invest in that would really contribute to Australians and our region's genuine security, and AUKUS is making the choice to not do that. And, you know, I think it's worth thinking about, like, what we could spend that money on to genuinely make us safer. What would that $800 million that the Defence Minister took to Washington, to the Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth, what could that have been spent on that might have made us safer? And how can we think about what makes us safer? So, you know, the question of Plan B, I think, is a kind of vexed one, and it's a conversation we need to have. You know, so often I think the kind of rusted on AUKUS supporters will say, well, what's your plan? Like, what equipment are we going to get? We're wedded to this submarine deal. All the submarine deals before this have failed. You know, you have to come up with an alternative. I don't think it necessarily needs to work that way. I think we need to have a much broader conversation collectively about our future and the future of our security and what that involves. And, you know, that doesn't necessarily involve nuclear-powered submarines. It might, but it might also involve investment in other things that make us safer, like, I don't know, climate action or health or education, things that could contribute not just to our safety and security, but regional safety and security as well. So I think sometimes the plan, you know, of course we need a plan B for AUKUS, but we don't necessarily need an exact alternative. You know, we don't need to spend $368 billion on some different submarines. We need to have a deeper conversation about what actually makes us safer.
Speaking of what makes us safer, you talked a little bit earlier about some Australia Institute polling about attitudes towards, well, what Australian attitudes are to different world leaders, including Donald Trump. Can you tell us a little bit about those results, I guess, and what you think that means for the future of our relationship with the States?
Yeah, so we did this polling back in March. A lot has happened since then, but we asked Australians who they thought was the greater threat to world peace. And given the choice of Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, Xi Jinping, the leader of China, and Donald Trump, more Australians, 31%, chose Donald Trump, which means more Australians see Donald Trump as a greater threat to world peace than the two leaders of the most powerful authoritarian states in the world, you know, one of whom is currently engaged in an illegal war, an illegal invasion of Ukraine. That's a pretty extraordinary result. You know, when you think about the history of the way Australians have thought about the United States and the assumption that the United States and Australia share values and that the United States is a guarantor of Australian security, for Australians to think about an American president like that. And it's worth mentioning that we did this polling before Trump's Oval Office meeting with Vladimir Zelensky, before this recent this conflagration with Iran that is incredibly dangerous. You know, I suspect those numbers might be even worse now, and I think that potentially at least represents a seismic shift in the way that Australians view our relationship with the United States, and it's in direct reflection, direct response of what Donald Trump is doing. You know, where we can see who he is, we can see that he has no care or interest in traditional allies, and that Australia is not special in that regard. You know, just look at the way that Trump is treating Canada. He's literally threatening to invade the United States' closest ally. You know, he hasn't done that to us yet, but it's actually not hard to imagine a scenario in which he does. Like, this is the kind of person we're dealing with, and I think the Australian community is responding accordingly.
So the G7's currently underway in Canada, and Trump, although I think he's left now, has he? Left early.
Yeah, got tired.
Yeah. Made some troubling comments, including about re-including Vladimir Putin as part of the G8, and also refusing to sign a memorandum calling for the de-escalation of the conflict between Israel and Iran. I say that like it's an equal conflict, but Israel did a so-called preemptive strike against Iran. But, I mean, we're talking here about lots of ways in which Australia is just much more distant from the current administration of the United States. Is it time for a genuine reorientation of that relationship?
I think it absolutely is. You know, I think often in Australian foreign policy, you know, those of us who advocate for a different relationship with the United States are dismissed as people who want to abandon the relationship, you know, who want to leave Australia kind of alone and bereft without protection from our kind of greatest security ally. And that's just not true. And I don't think that's why we're seeing those results in polling that I was talking about. I think Australians are really deeply concerned about what is happening in the United States. Like, we care about Americans and we care about American democracy. We know it's not in Americans' interests and it's not in our interests for American democracy to collapse. So I think it's important to say that at the outset, that this isn't about abandoning the United States. But what it is suggesting is that we engage in a rebalancing and a rethinking of the relationship that we have with the United States and what it is for. You know, at the moment, you know, hard-edged security is prioritised above everything else in a way that is anti-democratic. You know, it undermines the shared values that we are supposed to have with the United States. But that's not inevitable. You know, Australia's relationship with the United States is so much bigger than the military contacts or the security contacts. We have deep cultural links with the United States, deep historical links, deep institutional links, and it's entirely possible to refocus the relationship on those links and do things like enhance our elected bodies, you know, relationships, to deepen the relationships between the Australian Parliament and the US Congress, for example, and people in the US Congress who have an interest in the survival and the thriving of American and Australian democracy. You know, we have links between our courts, we have links between higher education institutions, which are under assault in the United States at the moment. We have extensive networks of students and academics and researchers that we can be raising up and elevating above those, you know, anti-democratic security aspects of the relationship. Nothing about our relationship with the United States is inevitable, and we've so often seen it as one-way thing, you know, where we're the kind of little player and the United States is the giant. And I think we really underestimate our power and our agency and our leverage in the United States, where we are greatly respected. And we don't have to go begging for scraps from Trump. You know, we can engage with the people in the United States who genuinely do share our values. That's entirely possible, and we're a grown-up country and we should be capable of it.
What do you think is behind, I guess, we talked a little bit before about the Democratic Party not really recognising the reality of the situation. But similarly, when it comes to the Australian establishment, and where you've kind of spoken about that real failure, not only to grapple with a plan B, but that we might approach this in kind of any other way. What do you think is behind that inability, that lack of imagination that we could do things a bit differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just partly that we've always done it that way, and there's a kind of bureaucratic inertia. You know, the people in the kind of foreign, broadly speaking, the foreign policy establishment are so accustomed to relying on American power and to admiring American power as well. You know, we have accepted, or parts of that establishment have so long accepted American exceptionalism, you know, this idea that the United States is the shining light on the hill and it can't happen there. That is so deeply ingrained that I think for some it's almost unexaminable. You know, it becomes an untouchable, even in the face of such a changed reality in the United States. And shifting that kind of bureaucratic cultural inertia is really, really difficult when systems have been built around it and around the assumption that it will continue on forever, that we'll always be able to rely on the United States. And, you know, the reality that maybe we can't is deeply, deeply shocking. And I think turning that around is very difficult. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult, especially when those institutions and the people in them are so accustomed to not being accountable and to not having to justify their policies and to being deeply secretive about what they are. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've been told by people in positions in government that, you know, if you only knew what I knew, you would think differently. Well, tell me what you know. And you know, they're used to not, and to guarding that secrecy and that power really closely. And it's a shock to be, you know, to be threatened with some form of accountability. But I think that is changing. You know, I think the landscape's changing quite dramatically. We can see that even with the crossbench, for example, recently has written a letter to the Deputy Prime Minister calling for a parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS. You know, having the crossbench be activists around foreign policy, when foreign policy has traditionally been seen as kind of above that kind of parliamentary scrutiny, I think is a significant and really positive step.
And the Australia Institute is currently running a petition asking people to sign up to really push the Parliament to establish that inquiry. And one of the reasons why I think that's important is you've just been talking about the fact that we get a lot of our information out of the Congressional Research Office?
Yep.
Service.
Yep.
And I mean, traditionally the UK and the US are just much more open about examining our security arrangements compared to Australia's Parliament. And that really needs to change, essentially, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really, really does. You know, there's no justifiable reason, as we were saying before, in a democracy, why you wouldn't have scrutiny on these kinds of huge decisions about the future of Australian security when, you know, they do it in the United States. The Congressional Research Service papers on US shipbuilding on the AUKUS deal are publicly available. You know, you can download them. I've read them and, you know, found out things about the deal that information that just isn't available in Australia. And there's no reason why we can't do that too here in Australia. You know, the American democracy is in many ways fragile and in a lot of danger, but that doesn't mean there aren't lessons that we can take from it around accountability where, you know, for example, Senate committees, investigative committees have subpoena power in the United States. You know, they can compel people to appear, they can compel evidence, and that's a good thing. You know, that kind of accountability is a good thing and something that we could emulate. You know, there's no reason why we have to be so secretive when it comes to these big foreign policy decisions.
We're going to go to questions questions from the audience very shortly. We've got a mic here, so if you've got a question, please start lining up if you've got questions for Emma. I did also want to acknowledge former Senator and Transparency warrior Rex Patrick, who is probably behind a lot of the FOIs that have given us information that we might not have otherwise got. Before we go to our questions from the audience, I did just want to end, I guess, back on the distressing nature of what's currently happening in the United States, particularly around ICE and immigration and the mass deportations. And I guess, can you just put that into some context in terms of what Trump promised and the effect that this is having in the United States at the moment?
Yeah, so Trump came to offer, again, he tells us transparently what he's going to do and what his aims are. He did it throughout the election campaign, where he said he would implement a policy of the biggest mass deportations in American history, and he is committed to that policy in a way that he's not always committed to the rest of his ideas, and that's partly because his administration is staffed by people committed to those ideas, including one of his advisors, Stephen Miller, who a former White House advisor described as Waffen SS. Like, this is the kind of people that we are dealing with. And the deportation programs are designed to terrorise. They are literally, masked ICE agents are literally bundling people into vans and disappearing them, doing it to caregivers and parents on the street and leaving their children alone. They are attempting at times to raid elementary schools, to take minors, to deport minors, and they're doing this without any recourse to due process for a lot of these people, which means they have deported American citizens and then effectively ignored court orders to return those people to the United States. So this is an egregious breach of the rule of law in the United States, and it is expanding, and Trump is using protests against these policies, which were always going to emerge. When you terrorise communities like that, of course they are going to protest. He is then using that as a pretense to send in the military against his own people, which again, he has been talking about for 10 years. He hasn't sprung this idea on the American people. This is something he always wanted to do, and is now talking about expanding that across, as I was saying, other democratic cities, including Chicago and New York. So this is the reality of what we are dealing with. This is a fundamental attack against the rule of law and constitutional rights in the United States. And, we will often attempt at least to draw kind of fake borders around what's happening domestically in the United States and what it is doing in the world. We cannot do that. We have to understand what the Trump administration is doing at home as something that will be projected out into the world. And we, as a great ally of the United States, risk being an accomplice in that if we don't stand up for our own commitment to the rule of law internationally and at home.
And I'm really sorry, I'll get to the question. Right, do you think you can draw a line between, I always just come back to John Howard and Children Overboard and the Pacific Solution. I mean, does some of this stuff, do you think you can draw a straight line between them?
I mean, not necessarily a straight line, but I think there is a connecting line where during the first Trump administration, Trump expressed admiration for Australia's border control policies. He used one of the posters that I think it was the Howard government designed, the "Don't Come Here" posters, and said, this is great, this is what we are doing. And that's why I argue in the essay and in my previous work that so often our relationship with the United States brings out the worst in both of our politics. But again, that isn't inevitable.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to questions now. If you wouldn't just mind saying your name firstly, and also if we can make sure that we're asking Emma questions and not making speeches. Thank you very much. First question.
I take it. Yes, it's on. James. Hello, Emma. Thanks so much. This just reinforced my dread. Yeah. So just today there was an announcement by the Australian government that they're going to enter into some sort of negotiations with the EU about a security pact. Just wondering whether you've looked into where that could go. Is this going to be peripheral, marginal, or could it be something more substantial?
Thanks. That's a great question. Yeah, I think Australia has always struggled to maintain a genuine and deep relationship with the European Union. We've always treated it as peripheral, I suppose, and certainly never really considered it a security relationship beyond what Australia has had with the United Kingdom. I think the fact that we're even talking about a security arrangement with the European Union or a trade deal, which until very recently seemed entirely out of reach, is a reflection of how much Trump is kind of upending the world order as we know it. I'm a little bit sceptical about a security arrangement with the European Union. It's unclear what that would involve. And I think, importing, there's also talk of a kind of NATO in the Pacific. I think importing some of those ideas risks reinforcing ideas about great power competition, and sometimes are designed to contain or antagonise China in a way that's not necessarily helpful. But I think my main takeaway from it is that even the fact that we're talking about it is such a reflection of Trump's assault on the world order as we know it.
Next question.
Thank you. My name is Craig Welsh. Thank you for talking to us tonight. I've enjoyed it so far. From my first speech, my question is this. When the US makes outrageous demands upon this country, such as a requirement to increase our defence spending, to take their crappy beef, to increase their boots on the ground in the Northern Territory, for example, thus, if you ask any Okinawan, increasing the number of rapes, all these terrible demands, is there any cogent reason that you can think of why the Australian government doesn't just say, no, Pine Gap? That's the end of my question.
Yeah. So why don't we say, well, fine, Pine Gap's gone?
Or just threaten it.
Yeah. I'm not sure that it would be productive to antagonise Trump directly, and I think particularly threatening Pine Gap would animate a security establishment in a way that would be quite shocking to many in Australia. And I don't think we necessarily would even need to go that far. I think when Secretary of Defence Pete Hegseth stomped around Shangri-La like he did a couple of weeks ago, demanding that Australia increase its spending, defence spending, even the fact that the Prime Minister said quite clearly, no, Australia will make the decision about our defence spending. Even the fact that he said that is significant. Like, to have that much pushback from an Australian Prime Minister, I think is quite significant. But I don't know that engaging in a kind of tit-for-tat threat game is necessarily the way to approach that relationship. And I think the reality of Pine Gap is also very difficult for the Australian government. Extracting ourselves from that agreement would be incredibly difficult and would take some very delicate diplomacy. And that's why, I would argue that the Australian government lost an opportunity with the Biden administration to recalibrate that relationship, where we did have a good relationship and shared values with an administration, and that left us exposed to Trump.
I don't think we'd ever get to the stage where we want to shut it down, but the threat of it, I think, and just one comment further, is that the only way to stand up to a bully is to stand up to a bully.
Yeah. And there's a political appetite for it. Just ask the Canadians.
And
yeah.
I would say, bring it on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you for your talk. My name's Jim Lindsay. Given how Trump stamps on traditional norms, do you think the midterm congressional elections next year will be free and fair? And do you think the Democrats have a chance of getting control of Congress?
I'm so glad you phrased the question in that way, Jim, because I so often encounter the assumption that Trump will be punished at the midterms. He's betrayed his base, and it'll come back to bite him at the midterms. And Democrats will regain control of Congress. That's the normal way of thinking about American politics, but things are decidedly not normal. And there have already been concerted long-term efforts to undermine voting rights in the United States. Those efforts have increased under the Trump administration. And I think Trump's made it really clear he's got no interest in the institutions of American democracy. He's already tried to overturn one election result and didn't suffer for it. And he and the people around him have learned from that experience. And I think part of the difference this time around is that the movement behind Trump in particular has learned the lessons of what they see as the mistakes of the first Trump administration. And what they have now is a generational victory for the far right in the United States, where they have Congress, they have the Supreme Court, and they have the executive in presidency, and they will not give that up easily.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Josh. I was just wondering, instead of the $383 billion for AUKUS, do you think there's any sort of possibility of reaching a diplomatic agreement with China to have security in that sort of corridor that supplies, that we supply our oil, instead of, instead of paying all those billions for the submarines? Is that possible? Or is there a magic third option? I mean, indirect coal liquefaction, we can turn coal to oil, maybe. What do you think?
I mean, I think we're already doing that. We already have a very successful trade relationship with China. Australia and this government in particular, to their credit, has very successfully managed what is a difficult relationship, and one that is, not without risk. I think we are entirely capable of managing that relationship and managing it relatively independently. So I think, so often in Australia, we have this binary understanding of foreign policy where either we're all the way with the United States, we're all in with AUKUS, all in with whatever the United States wants, or the very next day we're living under Chinese Communist Party dictatorship. That is quite literally how it is framed in much of the mainstream media. And that is just not true. War with China is absolutely not inevitable. It's not in either of our interests. And so we can manage that relationship. We can engage in conflict prevention and genuine diplomacy in trade, in the political sphere, in the security sphere, in order to avoid conflict. I don't think it's that complicated.
But specifically for a security agreement to stop say that they wouldn't blockade any oil supply. Do you think that's possible, or we're too entrenched with America?
I think it's entirely possible. I think Australia has an incredible weight of diplomatic skill that we can continue to invest in and invest more in, and especially in understanding China in a more nuanced and complex way. So those kinds of agreements are entirely possible, but they are made more difficult by our closeness with the United States and deals like AUKUS, which are explicitly designed to contain China. So often Australian governments act as if, China can't see what those agreements are. I think it's time for a pretty dramatic rethink of that agreement, but it's entirely possible for us to negotiate those kinds of agreements, absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next question.
I'm Fiona. Going back to what you were saying about the unaccountability around this AUKUS arrangement and how you're sourcing a lot of information from the US, do you think that, in 20 years' time, when records are nominally supposed to be released, there will be anything to see here? And I do actually have another question, and it's probably not much to say about it given the previous question, but why do we turn back to our old colonial masters when looking for alternative arrangements?
Such a great question. On the information one, I think given what we know about the information environment in Australia right now, it's unlikely that we would get the kind of information that you're talking about from cabinet documents or whatever. Rex will know this better than me, but the scenario I imagine, when the time period is up, when those documents are to be released, is that they'd be deemed essential to national security, and so would be entirely blacked out.
I'm wondering if they even exist.
Well, I think it's possible that
it was conducted in such secrecy that I wonder if records have been kept.
I
What
think
do you
that's
think?
that is a live question. I suspect there will be some records, but many of the conversations probably weren't recorded in that way quite deliberately because it was kept so intensely secret. Like, it is quite extraordinary that a deal like this was kept under wraps for a significant amount of time. I think there will be documents on the American side. Americans are have been historically, again, much better at keeping those kinds of records and at making them accessible. You know, as an anecdotal example, when I did my PhD research in history, on some of the history of Australian foreign policy, I relied almost entirely on American documents because they were accessible and the Australian ones weren't. They weren't for public release. And I'm still now, several years later, getting notifications about how I can't access those documents. So I think that will be the scenario, that once again we will get information from the United States before we get it from our own government. Thank you.
And the colonial...
Yeah, I mean, it's such a foundational question for this nation, you know, why we seek out the security of a great white protector over security from our region. You know, I think Australian foreign policy is driven by a deep sense of insecurity, and it is a racially based sense of insecurity. You can see that in the coverage now of AUKUS, where there's this assumption that countries to our north that do not look like our governments are coming to get us, you know, that they are coming to steal the land that we stole, which is a simplistic way of putting it, but I think it's a fundamental truth about the nature of foreign policy in this country. And you can see that again in AUKUS, where, you know, this is kind of brushed over now, but when it was first announced by the Morrison government, it was characterised as a revival of the Anglosphere. We know what that means.
It also seems to me that there's this kind of assumption that we all skate over when thinking about like that type of engagement, that none of these other countries are also grappling with China as a superpower and also, you know, like are negotiating their own relationships that they're in charge of. Next question.
G'day, my name's Jane. This is a bit of a tricky one, really, but I'm just curious, a bit of crystal ball gazing. I mean, you know, we know that Trump is ignoring all of the norms of democracy, of their democracy, and you said that the Democrats are assuming things will go back to normal after the next election. So I'm just curious about what do you think will happen?
I mean, I don't know. I wish I knew. Of course, I don't know. I think nothing is inevitable in the United States, and the United States also has a pretty extraordinary history of reinventing and revitalising itself after calamity. I think it's worth remembering, though, that the seeds of that revitalisation have always come from grassroots social mobilisation and the assembling of grand coalitions of people to stand up for constitutional rights or for the expansion of rights out from the kind of original recipients of those rights. And I do think we can see the seeds of that. Again, nothing is inevitable, but we can see the seeds of that in the United States in the protests that are emerging against what the Trump administration is doing and its policies. We can see the beginnings of that kind of grand coalition of opposition. The question in American history is really how bad things have to get before that revitalisation begins. And I don't know the answer to that question, but I would just emphasise that, you know, nothing is inevitable. It's not inevitable that things get worse in the United States. It's not inevitable that Trump continues to accumulate power. Things can change and change very, very quickly. It's not a prediction, but the seeds of hope are there, I think.
And when you talk about the seeds of hope, I guess, do you mean things like not only the protests, but I'm thinking of kind of not civil disobedience, but kind of civilians rallying together to kind of get on the loudspeaker and tell their neighbours about their constitutional rights when ICE knocks on the door and things like that?
Absolutely, that is exactly what I'm talking about, where you have people in positions of relative power in community, you know, standing up to ICE agents. And it's things like elementary school principals who are, you know, locking school doors and saying ICE agents you cannot come in. You have no right to come in without warrants. You know, in this country we believe in the rule of law, and that creates permission for other people to stand up. And I think, you know, a lot of the coverage of the protests over the weekend focused on the big ones in Los Angeles, you know, in Boston, for example, where the protest was huge, but they were also happening in small towns. And for people in small towns to go out to those kinds of protests, the risk is much bigger. You know, the risk of ostracisation from your community is much stronger, but people are feeling increasingly empowered because Trump is so bad, you know, because what they are doing is so awful, to protest it. And there is power in those numbers. You know, Trump cannot deploy the Marines to every city in the United States. And I don't think the Trump administration is prepared for that kind of mass resistance.
I can see we've got 2 questions here. If maybe I could get you both to ask one question after the other, and Emma can try and answer both before we wrap up. Thank you.
My name's Stephen. Our naughty foreign minister has sanctioned 2 fine upstanding Israeli ministers, and I'm just wondering, because the President of the United States is renowned for, among people close to him, a passion for revenge, I wondered if Mr Rudd needed to find extra security.
Good question. And the next question, our final question.
We've talked an awful lot about the Australia and the AUKUS, but we haven't heard much about... Oh, my name's Adrian, by the way. We've talked a lot about the AUKUS relationship. We haven't heard much about tariffs, which is certainly exercising the minds of politicians. I recently read an article in Foreign Affairs which considers the US as a petro-state. It speaks about the shale oil revolution in between 2005 and 2010, which changed the US after a very long period as a net importer of petroleum products. Then, at the end of that time, it had become an exporter of petroleum products. And the impacts of this among them were, for instance, the defanging of the World Trade Organization. US went from being a state which was very concerned about free trade to not caring anymore about free trade, and they refused to appoint judges to the...
Do you have a question, sorry?
The question is, how much credence should we... I mean, is this... I'm not sure if you're aware of the article, but is this thesis about the US is now acting like a petro-state, and it began right back with during Obama's time, it's more aggressive, far less interested in multilateral treaties and things like that, suddenly become... and also, it's going to impact the manufacturing because of what part of the thesis was the Dutch disease, which is where the value of the currency goes up and up and up, and then nothing else but petrol can compete.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And I mean, Trump is certainly behaving like the leader of a petro-state and wishes to emulate the kind of leadership of Vladimir Putin, who is also the leader of a petro-state. So, look, I certainly think it's an interesting question, and I think you're right to identify that there isn't an interest in much of the power circles now in the United States in the institutions of free trade. I don't think that's necessarily driven all by that reality. I think some of it is political convenience. Trump has been of that view for a long time, since at least the 80s. It's one of the very few things he's been actually consistent on. But I think, you know, our colleague, Executive Director Richard Dennis, would say that part of what's happened in the United States and in the Trump administration is a fundamental misunderstanding of the role that the United States plays in the global trading system. It's just not that important to it. And the impact of tariffs on Australia, for example, on steel and aluminium, without minimising the damage that it might do to those particular industries, is relatively low to the Australian economy. And part of the reason for that is another fundamental misunderstanding that's happened within the Trump administration around basic supply and demand. We talked, one of the other questioners brought up beef, for example, and, this idea that the Trump administration will refuse to buy Australian beef or will insist that Australia buy American beef. It's not how supply and demand works. If Americans don't want to buy Australian beef, that's fine. We can find another market. There are other markets for it. And that's part of the reason Trump's backed down on and why he consistently backs down on those tariffs, because of the basic misunderstandings.
I would also argue that Anthony Albanese is the head of a petro state. Australia is
absolutely.
a huge exporter of coal and of LNG, amongst the biggest in the world. And I'll just draw you back to the second last question about the safety and security of Kevin Rudd as an enemy of the state.
It's not often you feel sorry for Kevin Rudd, hey? I mean, maybe, that is an unenviable job for Rudd to engage in. And I think it's a question worth taking seriously, not for Rudd in particular, but, you mentioned at the start, Eb, that there have been political assassinations in Minnesota. Part of the reason that there's no one really standing up to Trump in Congress is because the people who do stand up to him have their lives and their families threatened, and some of them are sent bankrupt because of the amount of money that they have to spend on private security. This is the reality of politics and political violence in the United States, where you have these kinds of targeted political assassinations and a president who is not condemning them, who's encouraging that kind of political violence. That is the reality of the United States that we are dealing with, in which our diplomats have to operate, and that is a very new reality that we have to come to terms with.
And I even think in recent years, I think the whole of the political establishment, for example, was very shocked and responded that way when Gabby Giffords was shot, to then you only have to fast forward or rewind a few years to when Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked, and that was just kind of laughed off almost. Trump people around Trump, including his sons, make jokes about it on social media all the time. Trump, throughout the campaign, would often describe with relish what happened to Paul Pelosi, and that kind of normalisation of political violence has very, very real consequences, and is part of the reason, for example, that an LAPD officer on camera felt very comfortable targeting an Australian journalist. It has international implications as well. We're going to have to wrap it up there. Please give Dr Emma Shortis a round of applause. I also want to thank all the Australia Institute staff that help put on Politics in the Pub every month. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out, and thanks to the staff of Verity Lane Market. We love coming here every month to do Politics in the Pub, and we love that you all come out. Please support Verity Lane Market. They've got amazing food downstairs, or grab yourself a drink from the bar. And come back after a fabulous meal and a drink next month when, oh God, I asked about this just before I came. We're screening our Murujuga documentary, that's right. So the Northwest Shelf, Woodside's Northwest Shelf project in WA, recently approved by the Environment Minister, Murray Watt. Yes, exactly. It really threatens the future of the world's oldest outdoor art gallery and the incredible rock art at Murujuga that dates back before the last ice age. It's a record of not only Australia's history, but life on Earth, basically. And the Northwest Shelf Woodside project is one of the many industrialisation projects putting that under threat. Stephen Long, our colleague formerly of the ABC, an investigative journalist, and our colleague Eleanor travelled there, and we're going to be doing a showing of that short documentary and then Politics in the Pub next month. So please come back again when probably it'll be even bloody colder. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, and don't forget to grab your copy of After America, $10 for tonight only. Thanks very much, everyone.